So today, the feast of St. Francis, which we here in the Dominican order celebrate as a feast in our priories throughout the world, in part because of the close relationship between St. Francis and Dominic, who knew each other well, became friends, and established a long history of friendship with our two orders, or between our orders. But then, what should a Dominican say about St. Francis? Well, I'm rather drawn to a story from the very beginning of St. Francis's life, or at least his emergence as what we might call a Franciscan. Now, as I'm sure you know well, Francis was the son of a prosperous cloth merchant in Assisi, and unsurprisingly then he worked in his father's shop, selling that cloth to customers. Yet, so the story goes, on one occasion, Francis sold some of his father's cloth and then used the money acquired to pay for the restoration of a church. Not a bad thing to do, you might say, and certainly I'm all in favour for restoring churches. But the problem, as I'm sure you realise, was that it wasn't Francis's money to spend. The money raised from the sale of the cloth belonged to Francis's father, and Francis hadn't sought his permission to use that money in that way. Well, what happened? Well, two things really. First, the local bishop returned the money to Francis's father, and then secondly, on Francis's part, rather extravagantly, we might say, he rejected his family's lifestyle. He returned everything they had ever given him, even his clothes, and then he began a life of evangelical poverty. So this incident marks the moment when St. Francis breaks with the family of which he was a part, his birth family, we might say. Now, I think this is a very interesting story, particularly if we attempt to analyse it from a moral perspective. Certainly speaking as a Dominican, I'd probably say something like this: the rational will aims at the good in general. No created good can exhaust that goodness, and each such good is ordered to goodness, independently of whether we will it or not. Human beings can choose between goods and the means employed to attain them. Now, restoring a church might be that type of good. But, a Dominican might well argue, St. Francis chose the wrong means to achieve that good. He didn't have permission to use his father's money, and therefore the bishop was right to return it. Now, the interesting thing about the Dominican approach there is that one is not able not to will the good. Doing so is necessary. It's not free. It's just a matter of how we're constituted. So if one wanted to take issue with that, you might say, well, freedom is an absolute value. It's absolutely fundamental to what we are as human beings. And we could always choose between alternatives, whatever they may be. The will can always choose differently. Moreover, if that's true of human beings, then it's even more true of God. And in that case, then, one might look at this event from a different perspective, because one might say, well, regardless of whether created goods are ordered to good or not, fundamentally what matters is whether God commands a given action or not. And therefore, if God had commanded St. Francis to use the money to restore the church, then that's what he should have done. And once his father and the bishop realised that, then they should have let him do so. And broadly speaking, we could say this second approach is what emerges in Franciscan theology under the great Franciscan masters like Blessed Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. Notice it doesn't exclude the ordering of created goods towards goodness, it just doesn't make that preeminent in determining goodness. Now we can take it then a step further and apply the two models to the yoke Christ talks about in the gospel. Hence, the Dominican model, what makes Christ's yoke light is that God is choosing things for human beings which are intrinsically right for them. As such, they're easy, and the burden is light. On the Franciscan model, however, Christ's yoke is light because God chooses such things as he does and thereby makes them right for human beings. The great strength of the Franciscan model is that it encourages people to stick to the power of God's will, stick close to that, and one will be fine, the burden will be light. Isn't that really what Francis was doing when he abandoned all his possessions, trusting in God's will? It also encourages vision, particularly institutional vision. God may propose challenging tasks to the Franciscan order and indeed other institutions. But if you remain close to God's will, then you'll know it can be achieved. What about the rest of us, though? While all our Franciscan brothers and friends are holding fast to God's will, what should we be doing? Well, to a certain extent, we should imitate them. God's will be important, whatever view of it one adopts. And it's to the credit of the Franciscan order and to the glory of the Church that they remind us of this point.